Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk to you tonight a little bit about chalk stream restoration. What is it? How do we do it? Why do we do it? And what happens when we do it? A little bit about myself. I've been working in river restoration full time for about 17 years now. After a bout of voluntary work, I started in the private sector, running river restoration engineering sites for a small specialist consultancy. And then in 2012, I moved to the charitable sector as a regional conservation officer for the Wild Trout Trust. This involved working with communities, fishing clubs, other NGOs, and government bodies to design, advise on, and deliver river restoration. Then in 2019, I moved to Wessex Rivers Trust, where I look after some of the trust's day-to-day operations. I also run a team of 7 staff delivering river restoration, fish passage, and habitat improvement projects. Now, the threats that our chalk streams face can largely be placed into one of 3 categories: water quality, water quantity or flow, and habitat quality. Now, what's really important to consider is that many of these issues can actually overlap and compound each other, and in some cases create new and ever more complex and interlinked problems. I like to think of it as the 3-legged bar stool of river health. You need all 3 legs intact if you aren't going to fall over and spill your beer all over the pub floor. Now, thanks to some recent campaigning efforts, many more people than previously are now well aware of the impacts of 2 of the legs. One is rotten and decaying. The other is being consumed by parasites. But not as many people realize that the habitat leg has actually been broken off, smashed into pieces, and replaced by a spade. Now, that spade has been there so long that we've come to accept it. It's always been a spade. It's supposed to be a spade. So what is a healthy chalk stream? Well, a healthy chalk stream needs, obviously, clean water, sufficient flows. It needs good connectivity of habitat and good diversity of habitat. And by diversity of habitat, we mean a good range of habitat features. Now, what do we mean by habitat features? Well, we need things like submerged cover, overhanging cover. We need woody features. We need a good range of marginal plants. We need deep pools, shallow riffles, clean gravel. Silt in the right places is actually very important. We need sunlight, obviously, but we also need shade. And we need a good variation of flow. We also need good connectivity to the floodplain, which is something I'll come back to a bit later on. Now, as any 10-year-old can tell you, there is this thing in the natural world called a food chain. It's logical, easy to understand, and complete and utter nonsense. Predator-prey connections actually form more of a complex food web. Now, this slightly low-res image is a diagram of the food web for Atlantic cod. And my eyes hurt looking at that, let alone my brain. Other than driving home the point that ecosystems are complicated, I would argue there's not a lot of value in thinking about ecology in this way. However, we can quite elegantly simplify the system by simply following the flow of energy. This is a trophic pyramid. The idea is that energy is moved up the pyramid from primary producer to herbivores to primary, secondary, and tertiary or apex predators. Now, the great thing about the trophic pyramid is it really quickly demonstrates the simple premise that the broader the base of the pyramid, here are the abiotic factors, the more energy there is available for the next steps. And we'll come back to those abiotic factors a little later on as well. First of all, I'd like to go up one step and talk a bit about some of the primary producers, because you can't talk about chalk stream health without talking about ranunculus. It is quite frankly vital. Studies on the Dorset Froom, where the Game and Wildlife Trust continue their thankless and seemingly endless salmon research, have shown that ranunculus cover positively influences both the abundance and growth of salmon. An earlier but still fairly recent study has shown that salmon smolts in the upper size ranges are more than 3 times more likely to successfully return from the sea compared to smolts in the lower size ranges. Now, England's south coast salmon are genetically quite distinct from our other salmon populations. They're actually more closely related to salmon in Spain than they are to salmon in Scotland. Now, the salmon of the Wessex chalk streams are actually even more distinct, with some academics arguing it's actually its own subspecies, the appropriately named Salmosalia calcarensis, or chalky salmon. Interestingly, although they are genetically distinct from the non-chalk river populations, the chalk stream salmon actually appear to be quite mixed between the different chalk streams. Now, this might prove to be something of a genetic lifeline, considering how close to the brink they are on some of our rivers, particularly on the Test and the Itchen. Now, the trend-bucking 2020 lockdown run was really quite significant. We had relatively huge numbers of salmon come in that year compared to previous year. It really did buck the trends. So that suggests to us there's something really significant happening at sea. Now, we know that water quality and climate change are having an impact on what is, after all, an oxygen-sensitive cold water species. But commercial sea fishing and river water quality are huge, intractable problems that require tireless campaigning, political willpower, and above all, time to fix. And that's time that we may not have. Going back to ranunculus, there was a study that looked at the relationship between ranunculus and hyporheic, meaning under the riverbed, flows. This was at 24 sites across Europe. And that study found that flow through the riverbed was 5 times higher in areas not covered by ranunculus. They also discovered that ranunculus growth was strongly influenced by hyporheic flow. Now, this suggests a highly important relationship between what's going on below the riverbed and the growth of ranunculus. And that could have really important implications for our perennial chalk stream headwaters, perhaps arguably less so for windsporns, but for where the rivers do flow through the year, because it suggests that where we've got good abundance of ranunculus, those rivers are going to hold water for longer. They're going to dry out more slowly. So obviously it is a big problem where we have headwater chalk streams that are lacking in ranunculus. Now, you might not know that over 30% of the sediment directly under a crown of ranunculus is made up of the fecal pellets of Simulian, or blackfly larvae. So those are the little creatures that you might find if you run your hands through a strand of weed, these little black sort of critters. Now, these fecal pellets end up bound together by bacterial biofilms, and they get transformed into a kind of slow-release fertilizer, which the ranunculus has specifically evolved to make use of. It's a pretty amazing relationship. Enzymes produced by these and other bacteria, along with fungal enzymes that colonize decaying wood, break down hard to digest dead vegetation into readily digestible food for other freshwater invertebrates. Mayfly food is created by microscopic organisms that live on plants, tree roots, and dead wood under the water. A study published in 2010 highlighted the role of riparian and marginal vegetation in protecting and improving chemical water quality. It concluded that riparian vegetation influences water quality in many ways, from direct chemical uptake and cycling by living plants to indirect influences of plant detritus on soil, on channel chemistry, water movement, and erosion. To paraphrase that study, because it's already getting quite late, chemicals in a naturally diverse and dynamic river, especially the organic nutrients that we're normally most concerned about in our chalk streams, are constantly being moved around, processed, locked away, expelled, or otherwise rendered less damaging by a complex system of natural processes. Now, some of you might know this, some of you might not, but trout live in trees. A wild trout probably spends more of its life in a tree than most bird species. But the love affair between trout and trees is nothing compared to the love affair between trees and freshwater invertebrates. There was a great study published in 2017 which analysed the impacts of woody material used in river restoration in terms of its impacts on invertebrates. It showed that woody habitat features rapidly increase both invertebrate abundance and diversity, including helping rare species repopulate areas where they'd previously been lost. As any fly fisherman will tell you, this makes for great fishing, but freshwater invertebrates also do something more important. They eat algae, they filter the water with tiny silk nets, and they process nutrients. They have a key role in regulating water quality. But the habitat role of submerged woody material is just the tip of the iceberg. Fallen trees create pockets of intense scour on the riverbed. As sediment is lifted from the bed, the largest and heaviest particles drop back to the riverbed first, followed by the next biggest, and so on, with the finest sediments being washed away downstream. Now, this plays a vital role in maintaining good quality spawning habitat for salmonids. But the flow deflection also does something else interesting. It swirls around and bumps fine sediment together and causes flocculation, the clumping together of fine particles, which aids in deposition and ultimately in that processing by bacteria on the riverbed. Now, a natural gravel riverbed isn't just somewhere for fish to lay eggs. A significant proportion of the water moving through a river is doing so below the riverbed. This is this hyporheic flow that we talked about earlier. And as we'll see, this is really important. Let's imagine a hypothetical meandering river. Sediment is normally deposited on the inside of each bend where the river is slowest. And water is forced through the inside of each bend. So it interacts with an extremely high surface area of sediment. There's a lot of ionic exchange going on, a lot of chemistry at work. Gravel is also deposited between the bends, forming your textbook pool and riffle sequence. And water is also forced through the riverbed at the tail of each pool. Now, this is why salmon and trout cut their redds, their nests, in the sort of shallow glide habitat at the tail of a pool. They don't actually spawn on the riffles. It's the little kind of in-between habitat. The river is flowing through the gravel there. Now, let's imagine in this scenario that a tree falls in. So now we have this really complex pattern of water entering and leaving the riverbed with different residence times in the gravel. And there's a whole range then of opportunity for different chemical reactions. Now, over time, that dead and decaying wood becomes buried in the gravel. And this is where the bacteria and fungi start to break down the timber. And this is where they start to form those complex biofilms, these microbial communities that perform all kinds of interesting biochemical tricks. Now, this is where it gets exciting, because studies have shown that the pollution processing power of these bacteria is actually very significant. So the riverbed of a diverse, dynamic and functioning river is essentially a giant sewage treatment works. It's a chemical decommissioning facility, a natural pollution processing plant. Doesn't make the river pollution proof, of course, but it does provide a certain natural level of resilience. Now, this is what I hope most people would envisage as a classic chalk stream habitat. This is a little section of the Upper River Test, and it's easy to see why people love chalk streams so much. I mean, this is a gin clear aquarium with a clean gravel bed, flourishing with plant life, with invertebrates, with fish. And this is a habitat that can breathe and adapt to fluctuations in flow. It can pinch in during low flows, peel back during high flows. This is a resilient habitat, but unfortunately, this is actually what vast kilometre stretches of the River Test in particular actually look like. This is a population growth and climate change disaster waiting to happen. So what's going on? How did it get that way? Well, in England, we began modifying rivers long before the Romans even arrived on our shores. The Romans were probably the first to do it at a relatively industrial scale, making modifications for navigation, bridging, aqueducts, that sort of thing. But in the 17th century, the vast water meadow and water mill network was created. Now, so vast was this undertaking that almost every square inch of floodplain that could be made into water meadow was made into water meadow. And now we have almost no evidence as to the original, what they call paleo channels, the original chalk stream channels that would have once threaded the floodplains actually look like. We can use modern tools such as LiDAR, which is essentially bouncing lasers off the ground from aircraft or satellite. And on most river catchments, that will tell you where the river was. But around most of the chalk streams, all we find is the remnants of old water meadows. However, it was in the 20th century that our chalk streams received their most enduring denaturalization. Some rivers were deepened as tank defences as part of the Fortress Britain initiative. And then came a massive change to agricultural policy, and our floodplains were converted to farmland wholesale. Rivers all over the country were dredged, straightened, widened. The idea was to get the water off the land and out to sea as quickly as possible. Trees were systematically coppiced or wholesale removed from the riverbanks. It became all but heretical for naturally fallen timber to be allowed to enter, let alone remain in a river. And essentially, the driver here was productivity. There was a starving post-war continent to feed. If you, as a farmer, could turn one blade of grass into two, you were doing your job. The end result was really widespread devastation of our chalk streams. Whereas most rivers would heal themselves over time to at least some degree, for our low energy, low gradient, low sediment chalk streams, the change is pretty much as good as permanent. So the result is what we call canalization. It's taking rivers from a natural form to something which much more resembles a canal. And this has actually completely altered our very conception of what a river, let alone a chalk stream, even is. What many, in fact I would argue most people think as of a normal river is in fact just a man-made land drain. Perhaps only surpassed in this regard by the Norfolk Broads and the Somerset Levels, which are both below sea level. The southern chalk streams are probably the most modified of our watercourses. Now, of course, this isn't a localized or even a national issue. This happened all over the world and has been happening for a very long time. The image on the right here is the Danube near Vienna in 1849. That's what it looked like. And just 60 years later, it looked like that. Now, if you look to the right of this image here, you should be able to make out one of these paleo channels I was talking about. It's a lost river that no longer flows. You can find a lot of these just by looking at satellite imagery, Google Earth, that sort of thing. However, using modern techniques like LiDAR, we can actually see there's a whole range of these channels going across the floodplain. And in this case, somebody's built a railway line and a sewage treatment work straight through one of them, because of course they have. And if you haven't found it, the current course of the river is there. Now that's pretty depressing. The other great tragedy of the overly uniform river channel is that it tends to become even more uniform as it degrades. What little semblance of natural process of the river's ability to deal with pollution, abstraction, climate change is further reduced. Now, this is a river with no immune system. Compare that to a more naturally diverse river, and excess fine sediment ends up being deposited in the margins, on the inside of the bends, where it gets locked up by marginal plants, and where these plants take up nutrients, filter runoff. The bacteria in their roots process pollution. Woody materials scours clean the riverbed and maintains that hyporheic exchange, cultivates the microbes that improve water quality. And it's a channel that can adjust to high and low flows. Now, again, it's not pollution proof, it's not abstraction proof, but there is this level of resilience, and it's far less vulnerable than a dredged land drain. Now, all of that is troubling enough, but wait, it gets worse. We haven't even got on to man-made barriers yet. So artificial barriers come in all shapes and sizes. These were installed for mills, for water storage, for fishery management, a lot of them just for landscaping. I always say old Capability Brown's got a lot to answer for hydroelectric power, and for flow gauging. The Environment Agency is an interesting organisation. One half of it goes around building weirs, the other half goes around knocking it down. One half goes around pulling trees out of rivers, the other half goes around putting them back in again. Whatever the reason, barriers like this have a profound impact on fish populations. But the impact doesn't end with blocking migration. In fact, I would go as far as to say that blocking migration isn't even the biggest problem. Far greater is the impact of impoundment on habitat upstream. And less visible, but no less significant, is the impact downstream. Now, if you really want to understand how rivers work, you actually need to stop thinking about the water. Rivers are juddering conveyor belts of sediment where the water is really just the lubricant that helps it move. Now, you block that conveyor belt and the machine stops working. And of course, weirs aren't the only barriers to fish passage. Culverts, sluices, hatches, all kinds of things can artificially obstruct fish from getting where they need to go. And even tiny structures can have a significant cumulative impact. Now, studies have shown that the cumulative impact of even 90% passable structures can be quite severe, with 30 minor obstacles being as significant as a couple of 10% passable ones. 2/3 of the world's rivers are plagued with barriers to migration. In Europe alone, there are an estimated 1 million such barriers. Large dams grab the headlines, but the vast overwhelming majority are relatively small structures. And their impact is pretty huge. Migratory fish is actually quite a misleading term. We use it when we mean anadromous fish, as in fish that run inland from the sea. In reality, there are only a handful, 2 or 3, truly non-migratory fish, and most species need to travel very big distances between different types of habitat to fulfill different needs at different life stages. So now that I've thoroughly depressed you all, let's talk about what we can do about it. So if we want to improve habitat, there are a few steps. First of all, we need to assess the habitat we've got. We need to have a look at what's good, what's bad, what's abundant, what's lacking, and what happened to get it that way. Nowadays, we can make use of modern geospatial tools to look into the past. We can collate big data sets that help us assess, strategize, and prioritize issues. We can even model what the river would be doing if it was configured in a more natural way. Then we need to identify what the opportunities are. What material we got on site? Have we got a good abundance of trees? Do we have natural gravel? What's the vegetation doing? And once we understand the problem, we can often simply reconfigure the river using the on-site material, using riparian trees, using gravel from the floodplain, and undo the damage. Nowadays, we can often design elements of a project collaboratively, with landowners and other stakeholders from the riverbank using digital tools, and draft outline designs that can then be rapidly sharpened up into detailed designs back at the office. And then we can set about making it better. We can look to re-meander straightened rivers. We can reintroduce woody habitats. We can reconnect habitats that have been disconnected. And we can restart the natural processes that drive the ecology of the chalk stream. And the point here is that the story doesn't necessarily end there. Some of the best restoration projects have been delivered in iterations. You do something, you see what happens, you reassess and redeliver. Sometimes that takes generations. Quite often projects are delivered by one person and, then someone else comes along a few years later and a few years after that. And, sometimes the person that started that process is long since retired or even died. So where do you start? What does that first basic iteration look like? Well, perhaps the most basic, at least imaginative, but most reliable of stream restoration techniques is the humble log flow deflector. It's not particularly natural, but it is predictable. And it is at least a mild recreation of natural habitat. Now remember, the effect of flow deflection is especially important for gravel spawning fish like salmon and trout. Flow forced into the gravel provides a natural cleaning and sorting service for those gravel spawning fish. Something else relatively ubiquitous in small stream habitat improvement is the brushwood berm. These are easy to make and positioned in the right place, such as the inside of a meander. They'll trap silt whilst simultaneously accelerating flow around them and cleaning the riverbed. In trapping silt, they also trap the seed bank contained therein and provide an excellent medium for marginal plants to grow. Now, these techniques provide reliable, predictable, and relatively ordered results. But in working with such predictable, repeatable techniques, are we really providing the best habitat? Are we approaching it from an all too tidy, all too human perspective? The question I try and ask myself and my colleagues nowadays is, what would a storm do? Nowadays, we tend to submit our designs for consent, referring not to large woody debris or flow deflectors or brushwood berms, but to fallen tree analogues. We need to ask ourselves, wouldn't we get better ecological outcomes from mimicking much more closely the processes and habitats that the river inhabitants evolved to occupy in the first place? This tiny little willow limb here was dropped into the River Wiley, tiny little thing. A few years later, it had basically done the same thing that a brushwood berm would have done, but for a fraction of the effort and relying entirely on natural processes. Hinging, which is essentially hedge laying on a larger, wetter scale, is a great way of mimicking naturally fallen tree habitat. It's surprisingly secure and extremely time and cost efficient. Working with natural processes, we can actually get better results. You know, why build a big semicircular berm when you can just build the upstream half and let the river finish it for you? It's not as predictable, but you can't get it wrong because the channel will adjust to the correct dimensions as dictated by its own flow regime and its own sediment load. Now, this sort of dynamic dance of fallen wood, deposition and scour is how rivers naturally clean themselves. It's how new habitat features form, evolve, and are ultimately replenished or replaced over time. Now, thinking this way, we can still work with basic flow deflectors, but perhaps selecting less orderly shaped limbs, perhaps securing them in slightly more randomized, less human arrangements. Something useful, though kind of ephemeral, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, for higher energy rivers, something we use on not often on chalk streams. There might be one or two chalk streams, perhaps the Meon that's quite high energy, perhaps some parts of the River Nadder, is stainless steel wire rope. It's what we call a cabled kicker. Now, these provide excellent naturalistic habitat, but in a controlled way, so we can reduce the risk of unintended consequences. And essentially what we're doing is taking down a tree or a limb and cabling it back to its stump or to another tree. And this actually allows the limb to move around in high flows, just like a naturally fallen tree would. It can move around, but it's not going to shoot off downstream and get trapped under a bridge or cause some sort of problem. Using stainless steel Once the limb's rotted down and no longer poses a risk, the wire rope can be retrieved and we can introduce a new limb. So this is a great way of mimicking the dynamic changing character of these sort of features in nature. You know, they're not naturally things that stay put. Wire rope like this can also be used as a redundancy, as a sort of just-in-case backup for a hinged or a stake tree. You know, if in doubt, if you have concerns, if you're not 100% confident that a hinge is going to stay where you want it to, it's a nice way of just giving yourself a bit of peace of mind. Now, another and arguably more important time to ask what would a storm do is with natural flood management projects. Now, this here is an increasingly popular technique used to slow the flow and reduce flood risk downstream. This is a leaky dam, but we need to ask ourselves, what is natural about a vertical wall of logs? Can we get better results mimicking natural events? There's an example here from the New Forest where we used a forestry tractor and winch and a forestry excavator with a grab to replicate naturally wind-blown trees blocking the old ditch network. Now, the great thing about this approach is that we discovered that the friction provided by all those roots and branches actually helped to clean the water as it moved through the ditch network, meaning we not only reduce the peak flood flow and protect properties downstream, but we also reduce the volume of fine sediment runoff entering the river during high rainfall events. Now, unfortunately, not everything can be done with a bit of natural timber. Many of our rivers, especially our chalk streams, were damaged in abrupt, violent acts of civil engineering. And sometimes restoring back to a functioning, natural, resilient and biodiverse ecosystem requires an equal and opposite violent act. Sometimes you need big, heavy plant machinery and large volumes of aggregates and earth. Sometimes you need a combination of heavy plant machinery and softer biodegradable techniques. Sometimes you need to combine excavators and aggregates with woody techniques. And yeah, sometimes you might only need the wood, or maybe a few thousand plants. Now, remeandering and re-narrowing straightened and widened channels isn't just about making it look right. Over wide and overly uniform channels experience uniform flows. Now, this means if deposition occurs, it occurs uniformly. Whereas an appropriately dimensioned and naturally sinuous channel will experience a diverse and energized scouring flow. So this often means that by restoring the river banks, we can actually treat the river bed. By combining scouring and depositional features, we can move excess fine sediment from the middle of the channel back to the margins where it belongs, where it will provide habitat for wetland plants, for river flies, for juvenile fish, and it leaves the channel clean and clear for spawning. However, sometimes a channel is just too damaged to fix. Sometimes it is cheaper, easier, or just more effective to dig a new river. Now, this can be on a fairly big scale or a small scale. This is a Watercress and Winterbourne's project on an online pond on the River Anton at Charlton in Andover. Essentially, it's a landscaping disaster that turned a once flowing stream into a giant silt trap. And so we created a new channel through the middle, separating the pond from the river, which once grown in, looked like it had pretty much always been there. It's a great example here from my local chalk stream, the River Wiley. There's an old mill channel, which was bypassed and with a new channel cut through the floodplain. And here we see it developing over time until, again, eventually, you'd never even know that was man-made. Now, winning over stakeholders, landowners, fisheries, local communities, regulators, whoever, sometimes does need that iterative approach. Not everyone is comfortable with an untidy river. Not every fly fisherman is happy fishing around snags and drags, although they really should try, because that's where the best fish are hanging up. So we had to take them on a bit of a journey. And the journey goes something like this. So, okay, you were okay with that little bit of wood. How about something bigger? That limb, that bend produced a nice bit of habitat, didn't impact your fishing. How about we go a little bit braver? This section we restored is looking great. How about we think about it a bit differently going forward? And then over time, we start to get back to this principle of what would a storm do? And what we're trying to do nowadays is work with stakeholders as rather than starting in their comfort zone, we say, well, what if we start with something uncomfortable and we work backwards to a compromise? Now, this is a great example of what the end of that journey can look like. This is the Bourne Rivulet. I'm sure many of you know it very well. It's a fairly famous tributary of the River Test. And in places, I think it's arguably one of the finest examples of an aquifer-fed stream anywhere in the world. This reach has been painstakingly restored in iterations, project over project, getting a little bit wilder each time. And it's a fairly small stream where you can regularly find 4-pound truly wild trout. It's not without its water quality or extraction issues, nowhere is. But the restored reaches of the Bourne Rivulet are fast becoming what I like to think of as a template for other chalk streams in the region. And so, in understanding the history of our chalk streams, in seeking to undo the damage and embrace natural processes, we can build back lost riverbanks. We can re-establish lost cover. We can restore lost weed growth, lost biochemical processes. These are all test and itch examples, by the way. We can undredge and restore that hyporheic pollution processor under our rivers. We can restore natural channel gradient and cross-section and provide conditions that are conducive to weed and marginal plant growth, conditions that are suitable for our endangered chalk stream salmon to hopefully thrive in. We can adapt to climate change, giving our rivers back the morphological tools they need to adjust to changes in flow. We can unstraighten, unwiden, and diversify our chalk streams, building in climate resilience through increased complexity. So where do we go next? If we're talking about this in iterations, what's the next one? It's probably a talk for another time, but rivers are not meant to exist in a small number of constrained channels to begin with. We put them there. A natural valley should be a ever-changing braiding network of channels. In a completely natural state, a river is a floodplain-wide ecosystem consisting of a myriad of dynamic habitats. A healthy floodplain should be wet most of the year. It should be a carbon sink, a nutrient sink. It should be a pollution processing powerhouse. It should be a pressure relief valve for flooding and drought alike. And this is where we're looking to go next. Now, I'm hoping to come back at some point, hopefully not too far in the future, with some case studies of us attempting to do this in the next few years, where we have braver landowners that are willing to give this a try. And we'll be really excited to see what the ecological outcome of that would be. So I'll wrap up with a simple message. We can restore the natural immune system of our chalk streams. We can rebuild the habitat leg of the three-legged bar stool and buy time for the campaigners, lawyers, and regulators that are trying to repair the other two legs. We can do it. We should do it. And I sincerely hope that for all our sakes that we do. Thank you very much.